Good evening. You've enjoyed meeting the Ed Blado fan club, I can see already. You didn't know there were so many members. It's a pleasure to introduce him. Before I do that, though, I want to say just a word or two about the college. We need your support, as always, so at the end of the evening, think about it. Our world would be transformed if 100 people gave us a cup of Starbucks coffee once a week. That would transform our crises of liquidity every now and again. So if you really enjoy the evening, think about that kind of commitment. It would be a huge help to us. The joy of the college for me, of course, is I get to see the results in ways that other people don't, because I travel a lot. And I can honestly say that I rarely go to the States now without being met by someone who has met someone who was influenced by Augustine College. Any university in North America now, although we're such a tiny organization, we've had students come from Finland and Norway to Africa, to Australia, and in this continent from California to Florida, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland and PEI. I mean, not many universities get that kind of range, but that's what we've had. And the really important thing to note is that if you send your children to the modern secular university, the probability of them coming out the far end with an active faith is miserably low. Now, I know there's selection bias. You have to be something of an unusual student to come to us in the first place. But those who do come have something like a 90% probability of coming through the whole experience successfully. And en route, stopping the odd professor in their misdeeds. The one that comes to mind at the moment is a young woman with remarkable courage who in her first term in medical school in Ann Arbor, embryology was the topic, and the gentleman giving the lecture was being unaccountably lacking in awe and logic and courtesy. And looking at the early stages of the human embryo, he started making nasty comments about pro-life people who make the lives of people miserable when, look, it's just a tiny creature, they can start again. Cassie had the courage to raise her hand, and he noticed it and said, "Madam, do you have a question?" And then she said this, she said, "Sir, what you have just done is an ad hominem attack on pro-life people. That is disgraceful in a professor. I think you should apologize." How many students would do that in first year? What was even better was, at the end of the class, he was surrounded by about 40 students from the class who were the usual culprits, Orthodox Catholics and Evangelical Protestants. And a pro-life group was formed on the spot. I was there to give a lecture at midday some 6 weeks later, and that crowd followed me out into the courtyard after the midday lecture and didn't bother with afternoon classes. We had a tutorial instead. And that's what happens to our students. I think it's worth supporting. I hope I've given you just a little bit to think about whether a cup of Starbucks coffee or whatever it is might be worthwhile. Well, having made my plug, we now get to the more important aspects of the evening. How do you introduce Ed Blado? Many of you know him. He's unique. I don't think there'll ever be the like again. I keep finding new things about him that amaze me. I mean, how many academics start by going to Emmaus Bible School in Chicago and then spend time in North Bay, en route a second-rate university like Toronto, and then doing his PhD in Würzburg, gets bored, so he goes to Lebanon, drives his kids back in a beat-up old VW all the way. I mean, he couldn't do it today, and today must be tragic for you in terms of things you've seen that will never be seen again. He's been a good friend, and it's the kindly things he does that keep amazing me. They're endless. So what a wonderful combination. A wonderful scholar, a classicist, a friend, a good man, and I've no doubt that he's going to keep us interested for the next little while. I remember the first time I introduced him to my medical friends in our summer program, and after his talk on Alcibiades, one of them said to me, "I thought he was going to tell us what Alcibiades had for breakfast on the day he died." He likes details.
Thank you, John. You know, John likes to exaggerate. So there we are. At any rate, Alexander the Great. Who was he, actually? You came here perhaps this evening because hitherto you may not have known him or even heard about him. Well, here you are. Now, you've been here long enough to look at his face here, and you probably studied it, and I hope drawn some conclusions. Very energetic looking young man with determination, resourceful, obviously, in his face. But there are several things you cannot see from this face, which was found, actually, this piece at Pergamum off the west coast of Asia Minor from the 3rd century BC, and is today in the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul, which when you're there, over there, you will want to see this. Now, what you can see in it is that Alexander is supposed to have had a harsh, shrill voice. Besides that, he's supposed to have had fierce-looking eyes, which you cannot see here either. And tremendous stamina, unbelievable energy, incredible endurance, and able to run with great speed. So, who was he actually, and from where did he come? Well, Alexander was a Macedonian, and he came from Macedonia. Well, where is Macedonia actually? Well, it is up here. This is Macedonia, up here. Two things to be said about Macedonia. First is that in 359 BC, where our story begins this evening, Macedonia was not nearly as large. Perhaps only the half here on the west side and on the east side as well. Well, who were the Macedonians? Well, Macedonia here is on the periphery of the Greek world. Up to this point, 359 BC, Macedonia had not figured at all significantly in Greek history. And that takes us to the next point, namely, the Macedonians were actually barbaroi. That is, foreigners, but also barbarians. As Peter Brunt from the University of Oxford, a great authority on Alexander, put it, the Macedonians were not Greeks at all. In fact, in the eyes of the Greeks, the Macedonians were as barbarian as the Persians. Well, that sounds a little like exaggeration, doesn't it? But let me tell you that by 359 BC, the Macedonians had not produced a single poet, a single philosopher, a single dramatist, a single painter, a single sculptor, a single historian, a single town planner, a single nothing. So I guess they were barbaroi. What they could do was cut down trees and sell the timber to the Athenians so the Athenians could build ships. Well, what changed this? Here's the answer. Philip II, Alexander's father. He began to reign in 359 BC, and A.B. Bosworth, in his day probably the greatest authority on Alexander, at the university in Perth in southern Western Australia, said that within the 23 years, before the 23 years of Alexander's reign, Philip made Macedonia a superpower. Indeed, he went on to say that in fact, Philip was Macedon. Well, what did Philip do? Well, he expanded Macedonia geographically and particularly militarily in every direction. Now, for Philip, the military was fundamental. And Philip introduced, among other things, a new weapon. This weapon is called a sarissa. What is a sarissa? A sarissa is a pike made of cornel wood, local Macedonian timber. It grew to a height usually of about 18 feet. So the sarissa was usually about 18 feet long, and it was turned into two parts, two halves, so that one could be inserted in the other to make it easier for travel. Now, the important thing here is that the sarissa was not an attack weapon, but essentially defensive. And the point was to stop the enemy in its charge. This became a very, very effective weapon in Philip's arsenal. Well, to make things short, this all culminated in an enormous battle, namely the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. This battle took place on the 2nd of August, and here is essentially where Chaeronea is located. This became a turning point in Greek history and ancient history. It was a clash of two ideologies, i.e., the nation state as represented by Philip, and all the city-states represented by the Greeks. It represented the end of the polis, or the Greek city-state, as a definitive political entity. Equally important, for the first time in Greek history, the whole of Greece came under a single form of government. It is very difficult to appreciate the significance of this in light of previous Greek history. So what did Philip do now? Philip usually had a number of irons in the fire at the same time. He did three things. He created what is known as the Corinthian League. He called all the Greek states to send representatives to Corinth. And what he did there was to create a common peace. Sorry, you Greek chaps from the previous city-states, no more fighting. No more fighting. Now, this is very interesting because what the Greeks almost loved doing most was fighting amongst each other. And Philip said, this is it. And so a common peace. Now, this is not the first time this idea came into being. It did 50 years earlier But it didn't last. And the other thing that Philip did within this context was to talk about a war against Persia. Now that is interesting. Why would they want to launch a war against Persia? Now, here is where Corinth is located in the south and where these things took place, namely in 337 BC. Well, the War of Persia is a very interesting thing. I cannot talk about the details here, but was it to be a war of revenge or a war of conquest? Modern scholars have been discussing this for a very long time. Now, as for the War of Revenge, way back 150 years earlier, Cyrus the Great had incorporated the Greeks of Western Asia Minor into the Persian Empire, namely the Greeks along here. And 50 years later, these Greeks revolted. And along with help from the mainland, and especially Athens, they went in here into Sardis and attacked the city, which had a long, long history as the capital of the Lydian kingdom. And in the course of this attack, the city was set on fire. And it included the burning of some temples, one temple in particular of a significant local goddess. Well, the Persians didn't like this, and so they are going to get revenge and come and attack the Greeks and punish them for burning what they called Persian temples. Although it really wasn't a Persian temple, it was a regional temple. Well, the individual who took upon himself to do this was the great King Xerxes. And he came in 480 up along here, cross here, etc. And that means he had to cross through Macedonia. And Herodotus tells us that he had an army of 5,283,320 men. And they drank many a river dry. And they probably did, because Macedonia had some big rivers. Now, this is interesting because the Macedonians allowed them to go through, and they made their water, their rivers, available to him. Now, in terms of a war of revenge, had Xerxes ever done anything against the Macedonians? No. Didn't burn any temples in Macedonia. In fact, the only place where Xerxes really seems to have burned any temples was in Athens, because the Athenians had taken part in that revolt. So a war of revenge should it really have been on behalf of Athens. Well, this all raises the question, what did Philip think of Athens? Well, not very much, actually. So this whole question of a war of revenge, etc., but they could always find a reason if you want to do a war. Now, an individual who helped Philip very greatly in all of this was Isocrates, a famous orator from Athens, an Athenian. And he was now virtually 100 years old, and he was publishing pamphlets. For instance, one was the Philippos, and the other one was a Panathinaikos. Now, the great German historian Julius Baloch said that what Isocrates wrote was read from one end of the Greek world to the other. Well, what was he writing about? Isocrates was peddling the idea that Philip should unite all the Greeks together, knock their heads together, create a common peace, and go and attack the Persian Empire. So we don't know exactly whether these ideas came mostly from Philip or from Isocrates and some other orators. Well, if you're going to attack Persia, how much of it? Here is the Persian Empire, all the way around here. So how much of this you're going to attack? Well, Isocrates doesn't seem to have been very specific about this, and certainly we don't hear from Philip how much he wanted to attack. Well, this is a piece of audacity that is almost incomparable. When you think of little Macedonia up here by this time, it's going to attack the whole of the Persian Empire, or at least a part of it. Maybe they were satisfied with this part here, namely Asia Minor. Anyway, this was Philip's big thing now, and in fact, he took action. This was all organized in 337. 336, Philip sent a vanguard, a force of about 10,000 under two of his top generals across into Asia Minor. Now, Philip usually, as I said, had a number of irons in the fire at the same time. And in 336, he had another big iron in the fire. Now, and that was a wedding. He was going to marry his daughter Cleopatra to another Alexander, namely Alexander of the Molossians, who was away across to the west of Greece at this particular time. And he invited delegates from all over the Greek world to come to this great celebration. Now, Macedonia had two capitals. One was at Pella, which was a newer one, but the older one was at Ægai. And this celebration was going to take place at Ægai in the theater. And here's where they're located. So Pella is the one on the top right here, and Ægai here. And there's going to be a big celebration in the theater. And in a moment, perhaps of lightheartedness or whatever, on that particular day, Philip decided to disband with his bodyguard, and he was walking between two Alexanders, his son and his coming son-in-law. Someone who had a grudge against Philip dashed out with a dagger and killed him. And so we have Philip's assassination in October 336. Macedonia is plunged into chaos, as usually happened when there was a change of throne. Who is to be his successor? Two of Philip's generals saw to that, and it became, namely, Alexander. Alexander's accession. Now, in this process, all possible contenders were eliminated. And in what Bengtson calls, what happened was a typical Balkan bloodbath. Every one of them was eliminated, and Alexander came to the throne. Alexander was born in 356. Very interesting indeed. In 350, now remember, Philip came to the throne in 359. In 357, he married his sixth wife. Now, Philip didn't have six wives all at once, but now was his sixth. In 357, Alexander was born in 356. Now, who was this wife? Interesting indeed. She was not a Greek. She was not a Macedonian. She came, in fact, from Epirus. Here she is, Olympias, and she came from Epirus, which is here, way, way on the periphery of anything Greek. Now, Olympias is a very, very interesting individual. From what we learn, she was very vindictive, very revengeful, very, very cruel person. And this is of great significance. Now, Professor Bengtson, in his monumental Griechische Geschichte, says that unless all the evidence is deceptive, Alexander owed to his mother that demonic and unfathomable nature which was always a source of trouble to himself and those around him. And that Alexander was always under the influence of his mother. And Bengtson also points out that Alexander had a very bad relationship, a very poor relationship with his father, Philip. But one of the interesting things that Philip did was to secure in 343 Aristotle, the supereminent Aristotle, as a tutor for Alexander. And for 3 years, Aristotle was Alexander's tutor. Now, what did Aristotle teach Alexander? There's a question with which we have been wrestling for a long time. Now, Peter Brunt says that the lad will not have been able to follow Aristotle's philosophy. Remember that Aristotle, as Professor Bengtson puts it, wrote on every subject under the sun except one, namely medicine, and perhaps, adds Bengtson, because his father was a doctor. At any rate, of all those things on which Aristotle wrote, at the age of 13, Brunt may well be right that Alexander was not able to follow Alexander's philosophy. But Bengtson thinks he knows what Aristotle taught Alexander, namely Greek culture. Perhaps he even taught him Greek. And we have a few hints. We can't be sure about them. But Bengtson says that certainly we know that Alexander developed a fanatic enthusiasm for Homer, and particularly for Achilles, the great hero of the Iliad. Now, another snippet of information we have, whether true or not, is that Aristotle prepared a special edition of the Iliad for Alexander. Now, we have another snippet of information, whether correct or not, is that Alexander is supposed to have always kept two things under his pillow: his sword and a copy of the Iliad. More fascinating is what we have here. We are told by Plutarch, who wrote a life of Alexander, that at one point Alexander is said to have made the quip "tsein," transliterated, and "kalos tsein." Very neat, very cryptic. Namely, to Philip, I owe the fact that I'm alive. To Aristotle, I owe kalos tsein, namely how to live well, or the knowledge of the good life. Well, if that's all you can say about your father, that he half brought you into the world, that's a fairly backhanded compliment, isn't it? Whereas kalos tsein is in a totally different category. Now that raises a very interesting question. Did Alexander actually live well? Was his a life well lived? Very interesting indeed. Well, here's the great man himself, namely Aristotle, who taught Alexander for 3 years, whatever it was that he taught him, but certainly must have had some significant influence on his life. And while we're at it, here is a very famous sculpture of Alexander. It's very famous indeed, and I'll just tell you exactly why. This was found by, it's called the Azara Herm. A herm is a bust. And Nicholas Azara, a Spaniard, found this piece in 1779 near Tivoli in Italy, near Rome. And he bequeathed it to the Holy See. But it didn't stay in Italy. It is today in the Louvre in Paris. And if you ever go to the Louvre, you ought to go and look at this. It is made by Lysippus, who is one of the three great sculptors of the 4th century. And it is really a splendid piece indeed. Now, we are told that Alexander, now there were many, many sculptures made of Alexander, and he said that the ones he liked best were the ones made by Lysippus. And here, slightly different from the first one at which we looked, a vigorous, determined, significant portrait of Alexander. Although all Greeks' sculpture was in some sense idealized. Now, for Alexander to go to and launch a war against Persia, the army was crucial. Now, the army which Alexander led against the Persians was not his creation. It was Philip's creation. Philip created that army. Alexander's significance is how he used it, and his brilliance as a commander and his genius as a military personality is in how he used that army. Now, in this army, there were three individuals of the utmost importance. One was Parmenion, who lived from about 400 to about 330 BC. So in about 336, 335, just as Alexander came to the throne, he was about 65 years of age. He was an incredible military person, perhaps best summed up in a quip which Philip is said to have made, namely, whereas the Athenians had 10 generals to rule them, I've got one, Parmenion. Yes, Parmenion had enormous experience, very senior, unbelievably competent, and he was chiefly in charge of the infantry, but had more power in the army even beyond that. His eldest son was Philotas, and Philotas was in charge of the cavalry. And the cavalry was the main striking force in Philip's army. And then there was another son, namely Nicanor, and he was in charge of the Hippophists. Now, the Hippophists, the word means shield bearers. And they acted as the bodyguard, but were also an elite striking force. So between Parmenion, Philotas, and Nicanor, they had the most senior positions in Philip's army. Very, very important, very significant indeed. There was one other individual, namely Antipater, a senior general. In fact, it was Antipater and Parmenion who were chiefly responsible in Alexander's accession to the throne. Now, we think that altogether Alexander had probably an army of 30,000 foot soldiers and a cavalry of about 5,000. And when Alexander left for Persia, he decided to leave about a quarter of these forces behind under Antipater. Why? To keep the Greeks in place, suspecting that the Greeks weren't too happy with being forced under one single form of government, and they might very well revolt. So these are some of the chief personalities in Philip's army, which Alexander is going to lead against the Persians when he gets that far. Now, I can't discuss here, because of time, the sources for Alexander. They are very complicated, very interesting. But let me just say this. Virtually all our sources today for Alexander were written about 300 years after he died. So you're going to write about some event in Canada 300 years ago. What kind of sources are you going to use? Well, sources from 2016. How about that? And these sources differ significantly. They write from their own perspective. They're not all historians. Plutarch writes a biography. We have the geographer Strabo, and so forth. And they write, that's why we're still writing about Aristotle, or about Alexander, is because of the nature of the sources that we have. At any rate, let's now start with his career. Alexander is supposed to have been present at Chaeronea, at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338. In fact, according to some of the sources, he was the one who led the decisive attack, namely against the sacred band. That's 338. On to 335, Alexander's first year of reign. Three major events. One was up to the Danube River against a tribe called the Triballi. The other was in Illyria, and the third was Boeotia, and there in particular the city of Thebes. Well, here they are, up towards the Danube. Why did he go up there? Well, your guess is as good as mine. Arrian, who's the only source, he doesn't tell us why he went up there. Did the Triballi constitute trouble for Philip? No, we don't hear anything. Did they revolt when Alexander came to the throne? No, we don't hear anything. So we don't know. Anyway, he went up there, and when he was coming back, he heard that the Illyrians had revolted. Now, Philip had had great problems with the Illyrians, especially when he was expanding Macedonia to the west in this direction. And so in the summer of 355, Alexander had to spend a number of months dealing with the Illyrians. And it was a very tough going, indeed, for quite some time. But ultimately, he succeeded. And then, just after succeeding, he heard that there had been a revolt in the south, namely here, and the revolt was chiefly by the city of Thebes, the Thebans, who had had a considerable success in local military events prior to this. Now, this became a very interesting event. Alexander went from here to here in 13 days of forced marches. And in the end, it turned out that the Athenians were going to help them, and you would have thought that a lot of other Greeks would rally to Thebes' defense and help. No, they didn't. And Thebes was left completely alone. Ultimately, Alexander succeeded in taking the city, and something really horrendous took place. Namely, something like 8,000 Thebans were murdered or cut down by Alexander's forces. 30,000 women and children were sold into slavery. The city was totally destroyed. Nothing like this had ever happened in Greek history before. Greeks were talking about it not days after, not weeks after, not months after, not years after, but centuries after. And the women and children were not allowed to be given any quarter or any mercy at all. This was really extraordinary. Well, there are complicated aspects to it that I can't discuss here. And the sources don't tell us why. But modern scholars have at least suggested that it was meant to be an object lesson to others. You don't revolt against Alexander. Now, in the upper corner, you see this number. These will follow in all the slides to come, and they show Alexander's age. He's 19 years of age when this happens. Yeah. So very interesting indeed. Now this raises a very interesting question, which I have not found considered by any modern scholar. Namely, is it possible that the treatment of Thebes might indicate that Alexander was also contemplating that he may be gone from Greece for a long time, and he didn't want any revolt whatsoever while he was gone. That's just a suggestion. So, Alexander is now ready to cross over in 334, 22 years of age. He's ready to cross into the Persian Empire. And so he crosses from here, same route that Xerxes had taken, and just comes inside here into the Persian Empire. Now, who's going to confront him here? The Persian king? No, because the Persian king is still in his capital 3 months away. And he is going to be confronted at a small river called the Granicus, which is here, so just inside the Persian Empire. And it will be the governors, satraps as they are called, and there are 4 of them. And they represent essentially the whole of Asia Minor. And the most important of these was Arcites, because this was in his territory. And so these, with all their forces, meet Alexander at the Granicus River, and it becomes the first battle just inside the frontiers of the Persian Empire. But there was one other individual, very important, namely Memnon of Rhodes, the island of Rhodes. He was a Greek. He was on the side of the Persians. In fact, he had land holdings up in the region of Arcites. Besides that, he was related in marriage to one of the great Persian nobles, namely Artabanus. And he came up with an extraordinary strategy, very effective. So this is the spring of 334. Harvest is coming up. Alexander is going to have to live on the land. And Memnon's idea was, namely, just destroy all the crops. And secondly, his other point was for the Persians to take a force across into Greece from where Alexander had come and cut off his retreat. It was ingenious. It was great. Memnon was a very, very competent individual. The only problem was that the Persians wouldn't go for it, especially Arcites, because he didn't want his property, his crops destroyed. And so it goes to a battle known as the Battle of the Granicus. And these are the 4 chief individuals involved, and especially these 2 brothers, and in a very close pitched battle, hand-to-hand fighting, it comes to the point where Alexander's helmet is smashed, and they're ready to bring the death blow down on his head. And at the very last second, Clytus the Black intervenes. And one could say that Alexander's life was spared virtually by a hair's breadth. And so it was an amazing success for Alexander, this first battle against the Persians. Indeed, it was so decisive that our cities committed suicide. And so virtually the whole of Asia Minor fell to Alexander. So what does he do now? He's able to go south down the coast through Lydia with its capital Sardis and other parts of Asia Minor. And Sardis becomes here really quite interesting because he goes via Sardis. And here, this is in the initial stages. He just won his first great battle. How is he going to treat the people? And this is a very important place, Sardis, previous capital of the Lydian kingdom. So, what happens? Well, he liberates them from Persian rule, but he establishes a Macedonian garrison, military troops, to keep the Lydians under control. Secondly, he makes them continue to pay tribute. As Bosworth puts it, they exchanged one despot for another. Then something else very interesting happens. He goes down here to Miletus. What he does there is Alexander disbanded his navy, his fleet. About this says Bosworth, it could have been the most significant strategic decision which Alexander made in his career. Anyway, he continues south, namely down to here, namely Halicarnassus, which is a very important place, and it becomes a struggle between Memnon of Rhodes and Alexander. And this goes on for months. And given the ability of Memnon, etc., you can imagine that it became a very significant struggle. Indeed, nothing changed until Memnon's advisor from Athens died. And Memnon gave up the struggle there. And of course, you would expect now that Halicarnassus would fall to Alexander immediately. Not so. He'd held out. And Alexander had to leave. He left with Halicarnassus still in Persian hands. So what does he do now? So Halicarnassus here. What does Alexander do now? He goes round to Lycia, Pamphylia, and Gordium and spends the last of the winter and the spring of 333 at Gordium. In other words, down around here, here's Halicarnassus, down around here, and then up here and up to Gordium, which is approximately here. Now, Memnon is still alive, still active, and still able to do things. But Memnon dies at the siege of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos, which has, of course, been so much in the news in connection with Syrian refugees, this in the summer of 333. Says Bengtson, the death of Memnon on the island of Lesbos was the greatest stroke of good fortune for Alexander. If Memnon had continued to live, you can imagine, without too much difficulty, what problems Alexander might have. So, there's the island of Lesbos, if you don't know, and Mytilene is in there. That's where Memnon died. Now Alexander is free to move. Where does he go? Down to the Cilician gates, to Tarsus and the Amanus Mountains, and Soche. So, he's up here in Gordium, crosses through Anatolia, down this way, down to the Taurus Mountains, and to Cilicia. Now, here, the Taurus range up here, and it was very, very difficult. Very few places where you can get through. There were in the narrowest defile. It is said that only a single loaded camel could pass through. So it should be an incredibly easy place to hold up a large army. And so the Persians did station a force there, But for some very curious reason, they abandoned it. And Alexander was able to get through down into Cilicia here, where Tarsus is located. Whole episode there, he became ill, and at least for several weeks or months, he was convalescing. But now Darius III, the Persian king, had decided to come up, and he was coming up from here. Now, there's another mountain chain here called the Amanus Mountains, right along here. And then now something very, very curious happened. Darius decided to take a pass, and he went up this way, and Alexander was going to meet him, and he went down this way. And their fronts became reversed. Alexander is in a very precarious situation because of all the benefits of Cilicia were available to Darius now, and Alexander was really cut off. And ultimately, it came to a battle here. So this time, Alexander faces the great Persian king for the first time, Darius III. And this becomes a very, very decisive battle. Here is a detail from a painting, which we'll see in a moment, of Darius III. He came to the throne the same year as Alexander, 336. Alexander III, Darius III, both kings at the same time with a huge army. This battle takes place in November 333, known as the famous Battle of Issus. In this battle, Alexander is decisively victorious. We have a painting, we can't be totally sure, but it most likely is of this battle. This painting is about 15 feet long, about 3 feet wide. In fact, it is a Roman copy, and as a copy, it is a mosaic. Consists of about, people have reckoned, about 1.5 million tiny pieces. It's quite an extraordinary work of art. It was found at Pompeii in a house. It is today in the Archaeological Museum in Naples. And here it's a whole story about that. But here's an excerpt, namely, from this battle of Alexander. And here's an excerpt of Darius. Darius escapes and flees towards the east. And now we have a most extraordinary situation, namely the aftermath of Issus. What is Alexander going to do? Chase after Darius? Chase him down now? Now he's been defeated. It would have been a great opportunity, or is he going to stay on the coast? This has been very, very much argued by modern scholars, and I have my own theory about it. Now, the green here shows Phoenicia, this coast. Now, the cities of Phoenicia, most of them, went over to Alexander immediately. Aretus, Sidon, Byblus. But then a problem arose, namely at Tyre. This becomes extremely interesting. The city god at Tyre was Melkart. And Alexander equated Melkart with Heracles, whom you might know as Hercules. Now, this is interesting because Macedonian kings traced their origins ultimately back to Heracles. So, Heracles, Melkart. Alexander says he wants to offer a sacrifice to Melkart. Well, the people of Tyre want to be neutral. And they said, okay, Alexander, that's fine. You can offer a sacrifice to Melkart at his old temple. But at his new temple, no. Neither you nor the Persians are allowed to offer sacrifice there. Alexander bursts into a state of utter rage. Now, some scholars have seen Plutarch as indicating that the principal moral flaw in Alexander's character was an uncontrollable temper. And so in a sense, what happens now is that Alexander decides he's going to take Tyre, whether the people of Tyre like it or not. And he's going to lay siege to Tyre. Now this is particularly interesting because Tyre, New Tyre, is located at some distance from the coast. Now the old temple of Tyre was over here. Oh yes, Alexander, you can offer a sacrifice there. But over here, no, you're not allowed to. Alexander is determined to take this place. And so it's about 800 meters. And Alexander, now remember, he has disbanded his fleet at Miletus. He has no fleet. So all he can do is build a causeway across here. And says Bengtson, quoting another German scholar, Schramm, namely that this siege, in terms of determination and energy, is unrivaled in world history. Well, it was easy enough to begin with, but the closer Alexander got to the coast, to the shore, it became so much worse and virtually impossible. There's a very steep coast here, and the people of Tyre had all kinds of provisions, etc., and they could rain down fire and all kinds of things. They made it impossible. In fact, we were told that Alexander at one point was prepared to give up and go on to Egypt. And as Bengtson points out, it was not until the Cypriot ships, 120, and the Phoenician ships, 80, went over to Alexander that he was able to take the place. And then another horror story. We're told that something like 6,000 military Tyrians were struck down, killed. 2,000 were crucified along the coast. And all the women and children were sold into slavery. And the city on here, etc., was smashed, demolished, etc., everything looted. Another incredible story. And what did Alexander get for it? According to Bosworth, another object lesson. That's about it. Was it strategically necessary? Well, Bosworth doesn't think so. So a very, very interesting development. Now, did the object lesson work? Well, no, because Alexander continued down the coast, namely to Gaza, in autumn 1832, or 332. Now, Gaza was ruled by a chap called Battus. Did Battus take any notice of the object lesson at Tyre? No. And he put up a fight against Alexander. And Alexander had great difficulty, partly because of the sandy nature, and his siege machines weren't working very well. And 2 months, he spent 2 months. Can you imagine Alexander's temper when he discovered that Battus had taken no notice of what happened at Tyre? Well, ultimately, Alexander succeeded in taking Gaza after 2 months. Among other things, Alexander was wounded, in fact, twice. Once in the shoulder, once in the leg. You can imagine what that did to his temper. Now we're told of an episode which some modern scholars don't want to believe. Namely, that Alexander pierced Battus's heel, hitched him to a carriage, and dragged him around the city. Now, this is reminiscent of what Achilles did to Hector at Troy, except that Hector was dead when he did it. Alexander did it to Battus when he was alive. Now, Alexander is free to go to Egypt. Egypt in the winter of 332 and spring 331. Another very tantalizing question. Why did Alexander go to Egypt? Egypt had been incorporated into the Persian Empire in 2525 BC. And the relationship between the Persians and the Egyptians was, after that, not very good. And in fact, Bosworth thinks that the satrap of Egypt was negotiating with Alexander when he was carrying out the siege of Tyre in order to hand over the country. Certainly when Alexander got there, there was no resistance whatsoever. Egypt simply went over to him. So there was no fight, no conquering. Why did Alexander go to Egypt? Well, some have argued that it was an essential part of his strategy. Some of us don't believe that. Anyway, the greatest thing that happened while Alexander was in Egypt, namely, he went to Siwa, where there was an oracle to Zeus Ammon, Ammon, Egyptian god, Zeus, the chief Greek god. Why did Alexander want to go there? And where is it located? Well, it's not in Egypt, namely 290 kilometers west from Alexandria, and then from there another 260 kilometers south through a desert, big desert, in order to get to this oracle, which is supposed to have been very famous. Perhaps not quite as famous as some people think. So Alexander goes into the sanctuary alone with the priest, and he puts a question to the oracle. And we are told that the question he put had to do with his paternity. Well, I thought that was settled, that Philip was his father. Well, it's not quite so simple, because we're told that before Alexander left Macedonia, Olympias told him some secret that she had, some secrets about his birth, that she would tell him when he got back home. Well, there's a whole series of anecdotes about Olympias when she was pregnant with Alexander. Now, when Alexander came out of the oracle, or the sanctuary, people asked him, well, what answer did you get? Well, all he said is, I got the answer I wanted. So what was that? Well, it wasn't long after that some envoys came from another oracle on the west coast of Asia Minor, and they addressed him as the son of Zeus. Well, prior to this, Alexander had already been acting a little bit more than a man. And from now on, his behavior was really, in many respects, quite different. So we're going back now, and he founds the city of Alexandria on the way back, and then back to Tyre. Now this becomes very interesting, because immediately after the Battle of Issus, Darius made a proposal to him. Now, for whatever reason, it seems that Persian kings took the whole household with them, their families, etc. And when Alexander was victorious in the Battle of Issus, and Darius fled, his family fell into Alexander's hands. Namely, Darius' mother, Sisygambis, his wife, Statira, two of his daughters, and a young son. What incredible pawns did Alexander have now? Well, in a proposal, Darius offered a ransom and also to make an alliance of friendship with Alexander. We're not sure whether the quip is correct, but we're told in one place that Alexander wrote back to Darius and said, the next time you write a letter to me, please, would you address it as Alexander, King of Asia? Wow. And this is before he went to Siwa and got some information about his paternity. Now at Tyre, again, he receives another proposal from Darius with 4 components. 1, the Euphrates as a frontier. 2, an alliance of friendship. 3, 30,000 talents to ransom his family. And 4th, his eldest daughter in marriage. And we're told, whether true or not, that there was a big discussion in Alexander's camp. And the eminent and senior Parmenion is said to have said, Alexander, if I were you, I would accept this proposal. To which Alexander is supposed to have quipped, I would accept it if I were Parmenion. Well, you can see that after his visit to Siwa, this might not be so surprising. Well, there's nothing left now for Darius but to fight again. And so we come to another very major battle, namely at Gaugamela. The 1st of October, 331. 1st of October, how do we know that? Well, on the 29th of September at 9:30 in the evening, there was an eclipse of the moon. And so that is significant in the chronology. So where's Gaugamela? Gaugamela is not too far from modern Mosul, on the upper reaches of the Tigris River. The third major battle between Alexander and the Persians, the second one between Alexander himself and the great king. Result, Alexander is decisively victorious. The king flees again to the east. Let us just do a resume. Granicus, spring 334. Issus, November 333. Gaugamela, October 331. Result, the Persian Empire is virtually finished. 3 battles. Alexander does all this between the ages of 22 and 25. King has gone to the east. Everything is open to the east to Alexander. What does he do? He moves on to Babylon. 460 kilometers in 3 weeks, thinks Bosworth. And this he is going to make his new capital. And the city is handed over to him by the local Persian satrap. No resistance, no opposition. Very significant indeed. Stays there about a month, and he moves on to Susa. Another 365 days, or 65 kilometers in 20 days. Susa was the political capital of the Persian Empire. No resistance, no opposition. Alexander simply walks in. Not only there, he gains control of 40,000 talents of gold and silver, and 9,000 talents in coined money, gold darics. And simply the metaphorical significance of taking over the political capital of the Persian Empire is very great indeed. From there, he moves on to Persepolis. Persepolis, still in the same year, 331, Persepolis is the cultural capital of the Persian Empire. A great city, wonderful place actually. And there Alexander lets his troops loose to loot and kill and so forth. Indeed, many of the nobility, the women in particular, commit suicide, we're told, rather than falling into the hands of Alexander's troops. And there's a lot of looting and so forth. Not only that, there was a great palace, an enormous palace, a great palace. If you can ever get to Iran, you should go to Persepolis. and see what is still left in its ruins. It was a jewel, an architectural jewel. And from there, Alexander found in the treasury the equivalent of 120,000 talents of gold and silver. Probably enough to take care of the Canadian national debt several times over. And they cleaned it out. And E.F. Schmidt, leading an archaeological expedition from the University of Chicago earlier in the 20th century, didn't find anything, didn't find a piece. And in fact, we are told that the Persians so fought over it that some of them killed themselves for some of the treasure. And Alexander organized mules and horses and wagons and whatnot, cleaned it all out, and started to cart it off away from Persepolis. But then something very interesting happened, namely, Alexander decided to set fire to this palace. Yes. And it may be that there was an Athenian component to this, because there was an Athenian woman, a courtesan, who was along for the ride. Her name was Thais. And on an evening when they had a drinking party, she, according to one source, came up with the idea of setting this place on fire, and that would punish the Persians for burning the Acropolis in Athens. Well, that's what happened. Well, we talk about the Taliban and ISIS destroying cultural heritage. Alexander was good at it too. Now this, if anything, should have meant the end of the war of revenge. In fact, Parmenion was supposed to have said, "Look, Alexander, you've conquered this place. It's your property. Why do you want to destroy your own property?" So, the burning of the palace of Persepolis was a very significant event indeed. Well, what next? Alexander should now go home. War of revenge is finished. No, Darius is still alive. Let's chase him. So he starts off to chase Darius. And Darius is in the heart of the old Median kingdom, namely at Ecbatana. And that is here on the map. Now Alexander goes after him. And he gets to Ecbatana, and Darius is gone. Darius has taken off in this direction, up in here, and Alexander after him. And Alexander does now what some scholars have called some of the most arduous chasing and marching that he did in his whole career. He is determined to get Darius. But when he does catch up with him ultimately, but Darius is dead. Namely, thanks to several of his chief people, namely Bessus and Nazarbazanes. He is murdered. Alexander sends his body back to Persepolis for burial. But now he takes after Bessus, because Bessus has killed the king. He is a regicide. So he starts to chase Bessus, and namely up in this direction. Now, I'm going to have to stop here in a minute because I've taken up too much time, but I do want to tell you this, because Bessus was a satrap of this region here. Now, can I tell you what this region is?
Afghanistan.
Right up here? This is Afghanistan. Yeah, in there. Now, let's put this question. If Alexander could have known what happened to the British in Afghanistan in 1839 to 1843, and if he could have known what happened to the Russians in the 1970s, and if he could have known what happened to the Americans and the Canadians in Afghanistan more recently, would he have ventured into Bactria, as it was then known? Well, I think he would. But he didn't do it immediately because he ran into trouble further south. Namely, into this region down here. Now here, at a place called Fratra, something terrible happened. Really very extraordinary indeed. And it has to do with Philotas and Parmenion. There was a conspiracy detected against Alexander. And Philotas, as you remember, is at the head of the cavalry. And he becomes implicated. He's put on trial, under torture. Most of us think that he was not guilty at all, but he was found guilty and executed, probably by stoning. Now, what is going to happen to Parmenion? Parmenion, is now edging 70 years. With all his prestige, all his experience, all his seniority, all his significance. What is going to happen to him in light of Philotas' death? We are here with Philotas. Parmenion is over here at Ecbatana, taking care of the treasure from Persepolis. And it looks as if by this time Alexander is already shunting Parmenion aside. In short, Alexander decides to kill Parmenion. And he sends racing camels from here over to Ecbatana with instructions to several of his generals to kill Parmenion. As Bengtson says, this gives us a terrifying glance into Alexander's soul, and is probably the low point in his entire career. Well, I'm going to stop because we need to have this part, because we're going to perhaps have some questions. But to point out, Alexander, let's have a map and see what happens. Alexander continues over here somewhere. Who is Clytus the Black also loses his life. And in a drunken party, Alexander kills him. This is the one who saved his life at the Granicus. So they get into an incredible argument. And then even further over, Callisthenes, who was taken along as the historian, who was a relation of Aristotle, a Greek, he is also executed. So there's some incredible things that happen in this area of Bactria. Alexander ultimately goes down here and he reaches the very end. Namely, his army would go no further at a river called the Iphisus. And by this time, some scholars think they had covered something like 20,000 kilometers since they left Macedonia. An unbelievable feat in marching. And incidentally, in terms of Bactria, Bengtson says these were the 3 most difficult years of Alexander's career. Yes, well, the British could tell him a few things, and the Russians, and so forth. And he comes down after that, down the river. He's wounded very badly here, comes around here, does something very extraordinary, goes through a desert here, etc., and comes up over on this side, and they start celebrating and some binge drinking. And from here on backwards, etc., to very considerable binge drinking. And this may have had an effect on Alexander's health. Now, we come back ultimately to Babylon. In 323, the last year of Alexander's life, which he wants to make his capital. This grand place, Babylon, etc. This is a restoration drawing, but it gives some idea of the magnificence of this place. And Alexander died here on the 10th of June, 323, at the age of 33. And so what of Alexander's career? Bosworth, who has written one of the most thoughtful books recently on Alexander, raises this question. But before I go to his question, here is an artistic representation at Babylon. This lion, magnificent piece, could be symbolic in a way of Alexander's career. He strode like a lion through the Persian Empire, and nothing stopped him. It was conquest from one end to the other. And in military terms, a genius, etc. If you read the details of what he did and what he accomplished in that respect, very interesting indeed. Bosworth raises this question: was Alexander a magnanimous conqueror or an intemperate tyrant? Bosworth does not actually answer the question. But it is one thing to think about what this might actually mean. Now, I'm supposed to talk also, and I want to talk a little bit about some ramifications for Christianity in Alexander's career. And I would like to use the term, what I call the law of unintended consequences, or if you like, divine providence. Now, Alexander's empire disintegrated almost as soon as he died. He never designated a follower. He never appointed a follower. We know of nothing in writing by him about anything would happen after him, nothing about any instructions which he gave, and nothing about what he ever said about what, in case he could die. And of course, he could be killed any time. So he seems not to have made, as far as the sources are concerned, any provisions for anything after his death. So what did he actually intend? And at the time of his death, he was already thinking of more conquests, namely the whole of North Africa, right through the Straits of Gibraltar, the whole of the West. And it's there in the records very clearly. So more conquest, and more conquest. What about what he had conquered? What was to happen with that? We have nothing from him. But there are some things that happened which he obviously didn't intend, which he never foresaw, and which did come about, which have had major consequences for world history. And they're tied up with him, ultimately, in great significance. One thing that Alexander did was to found cities, and he called them Alexandria. And Plutarch tells us there were at least 70. How would you like to have, in Ontario, 70 places called Bladoville? That's exactly what Alexander did. All these Alexandria cities. And then in this map, you can't really see very well the red, but there are many red places. And these are cities which his successors founded. So many cities that Alexander founded. Now, most of these were for military reasons, manned by Macedonian soldiers as garrisons, and various other things that went with it. Now, of all these cities, I want to draw your attention very briefly to two, as indicated by the arrows here. Now, What Bengtson says what happened after Alexander's conquest was a major period of settlement, of colonization. In fact, he calls it the greatest period of colonization in Greek history. Greeks poured into this vast region. Now, what is very interesting about this is that these people who poured in were not Macedonians. They were Greeks, Greek cities. And it is unbelievable. Look at tiny little Greece here. These people came from Greece, and they went into the whole of the empire, and into Egypt, into the whole of the empire. And they founded in these cities, and they took with them Greek culture. This became most significant indeed. And the two cities on which I would like to concentrate for just a moment are Alexandria in Egypt and Antioch on the coast of Syria. Very interesting what transpires there. And now a quote from Peter Brunt again, which he encapsulates here, I think, very significantly. The Macedonian kingdoms in the Near East, which arose out of the ruins, yes, the ruins of Alexander's empire, were to diffuse Greek culture among the Oriental subjects. This, in very brief, gives us a picture, indeed, of what happened. And it is very, very significant indeed. So, Greek culture diffused in this vast area, which Alexander, as far as we know, Alexander never talked about colonizing. In fact, Alexander didn't think much of the Greeks. In his army, he had told 7,000 Greeks, but he never used them at the front. These Greeks never contribute anything significantly into three major battles in which he conquered the Persian Empire. And some scholars think that he really took them along as hostages, used them for minimal purposes, etc. So this whole business of a war of revenge seems a little bit flimsy to some extent. And yet, after his death, which he probably didn't intend, there's nothing written about it, it was the Greeks that poured into his vast empire, and they diffused Greek culture in these areas. Now, Professor Bengtson has a chapter in his monumental history which he calls the universal sovereignty of the Greek mind. And in the year before he died, he wrote a book under the title Die Hellenistische Weltkultur, Hellenistic World Culture. It is in this period that enormous things happen. This is a period when we have Euclid, for instance, Eratosthenes, advances in medicine, in astronomy, the heliocentric character of the solar system, coming close to understanding the nervous system, and many, many other things that took place. And so Bengtson was able to write about the universal sovereignty of Greece. It is amazing, really amazing what happened in the next century after Alexander's death. Probably he never intended it, never thought about it. He was thinking about conquest. He wasn't thinking, at least there's nothing in writing about what he intended to do. But it came about, and I would call it the law of unintended consequences. And one of the greatest things that happened in this situation is the Greek language. Yes, over this vast territory, Greek became the lingua franca. Very, very important indeed. Among other things, it is not insignificant that ultimately the New Testament was written in Greek. Now, probably Alexander never intended to have Greek spread in this way, but it did. And Bengtson, for instance, refers to the translation which took place under the second Ptolemy of the Old Testament into Greek, known as the Septuagint, which Bengtson says was one of the great projects of the time. And there are other translations as well, most significant indeed. And there are two institutions which were pivotal in this. One is the gymnasium. Now, the gymnasium was something quite different from what we understand by gymnasium. fact, it's had a very long history. And today, still in Germany, the high school is called a gymnasium. So the gymnasium was really a cultural institution. And it took place in all of the cities that were founded by Alexander and his followers. Alexander never talks about a gymnasium. Nothing of this kind is said. We don't hear, but it did take place. And most particularly in Alexandria was the Museion, from which, of course, we get the word museum, but a Museion was much more. It was a research institute started by Ptolemy II, who reigned from 285 to about 243. This became a research institute, and all kinds of things happened there. Medicine, mathematics, astronomy, you name it, Euclid, and so forth. And within the Museion, also a huge library with probably several thousand scrolls, etc. So philology was taking place in the Museion, etc. Great. And between the gymnasium and the Museion, this created a context for the flourishing of culture such as never before had happened in the ancient world. And that too was probably something to do with what I would call the law of unintended consequences and also divine providence. And there's nothing, Alexander never talks about anything like this. We're never told why he founded the city of Alexandria. Never told in the sources, and this is part of the outcome. But into this also came Christianity. And here I would like to quote from the Apostle Paul, whom I, whether correctly or incorrectly, think was probably the greatest mind in antiquity. And this is what he wrote: when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman. And that is Jesus of Nazareth. And the appearance of Jesus of Nazareth on this earth is of the utmost significance. And Paul saw it in this sense. And it could also be regarded as part of the law of unintended consequence, divine providence. Alexander never expected anything like this, but it is still bound up in a way with his empire. And now to the other city, Antioch. Very interesting indeed. Located here on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. This city was founded in 301 by Seleucus I, who was one of Alexander's generals. And he named it after his father, Antiochus. Antioch ultimately became either the third or the second largest city in the Roman Empire, possibly with a population of 500,000. Now, what is very interesting about Antioch is that we're told by the historian Luke that this is the place where the followers of Jesus were first called Christians. And what is very interesting about Antioch as well is that Italian archaeologists excavating in the first part of the 20th century found hundreds and hundreds of mosaics, beautiful pieces of art. And one of the most fascinating, I think, is this one with this beautiful frame here, female figure in the center, and an inscription consisting of one word, namely soteria, soteria, which translated means safety in the first place, but also salvation. Seems to suggest to me that people in Antioch were longing for something like salvation. And what is very interesting indeed, it is here a painting of the Apostle Paul. It was from Antioch, that Paul went out on his 3 missionary journeys from about 46 to 52 AD. And this, Paul's work, probably more than anything else, spread the gospel or the news of salvation, which was represented by Jesus of Nazareth. And another thing that Paul did that Alexander never did, Paul wrote. I think this is one of the most lovely paintings I've seen, namely representing the Apostle Paul sitting and writing some of his letters. And Paul's letters have had such an enormous influence in world history. They are still read today in every corner of the world. And they are not only read, but they are understood as well, with that message that Paul took out with him. Now, it may seem to some perhaps a bit fanciful, but I think this is all bound up in a way with Alexander. Even with his consequences, with his conquests, we've obviously never thought of things like this, but these are some things that came out of his activity, however you want to evaluate his own career. But this ultimately is part of the story. And I think it is an incredible story, indeed, a magnificent story, indeed, how this all unfolded. And we in Western culture have been in many ways the beneficiaries. Here, the Apostle Paul, like others at his time, writing those significant letters that he did to the churches where he worked. I apologize that I've taken so much of your time. Thank you very much.
I think tour de force doesn't do justice to that. He told me his memory's failing him a bit, you know. The rest of us would like to have what he's got left and think we were much better off with it. If any of you would like to risk a question, he'd be happy to try and answer it. The young have temerity. Yeah?
Thank you very much for the presentation. Just a couple questions. Who was ruling Macedonia when Alexander wasn't there?
Antipater, with those forces he left behind, near a quarter of his army.
I see. Okay, thank you. And do we have by any chance any accounts of Alexander encountering Jews in his travels through Palestine or anything like that?
We have one tidbit, namely that on the way back from Egypt in 331, he did a short side, you wouldn't call it a trip, but actually some military activity in Samaria. That's all we have in the sources about that.
I see. Thank you very much.
It's interesting on that question. There is a
Go to the microphone.
tradition. Well, can you hear me?
We want to record it, that's the point.
Okay. There's an interesting Hebrew tradition that the rabbis have that Alexander the Great actually did come to the gates of Jerusalem. And he was greeted there by priests and the elders who explained to him the prophecy of Daniel. And the prophecy of Daniel plainly says that the king of Greece would conquer the whole world at that time. And Alexander was so impressed by it that he left Jerusalem alone. Now, I don't have the evidence of this, but apparently it's in Judaic tradition. So I imagine you'd have to talk to a rabbi or something, because it is in Jewish tradition.
I don't know anything about this, and in terms of the sources, which we do have, those 6 sources which I mentioned. I don't think there's anything in there. So I'm not able to comment on whether that actually took place or whether it is feasible. But there are many things which we do not know. I don't know of anything in Josephus about that. He might have mentioned it because he was exceptionally well educated, had spent some time in Rome, and covered a lot of ground in his several works. But I don't know of anything in Josephus. Maybe someone else here does.
Professor, how did he die?
Oh, this is a great question. How did Alexander die? This has been discussed at such great length. There are essentially 2 theories, namely, he's supposed to have kept a journal, and we don't know whether that journal is correct or not, but it, according to some, it gives an account of his last 10 days. He sustained a fever, according to that tradition, and he became increasingly ill until ultimately he lost consciousness. Now, when he was down, I didn't cover this, but going down the Indus River, he was attacked, and he was very irrational in terms of, the way he attacked there. He plunged in, and he got wounded, and he was hit by an arrow which pierced his lung, and it took a long time for him to recover. And this may have affected his immune system from then on. And then you combine that with the heavy drinking that took place, and that also he passed through a malarial area. All of these things might have significantly affected his immune system, and this may be part of his death, or leading to his death, but we just can't be sure. Now, there's one other tradition, namely that he was poisoned, and the individual responsible for that was the family of Antipater. And, again, some people take this simply as here, so there's no way of confirming it. We just don't know.
Hello, thank you very much for the lecture. A couple of questions, if you wouldn't mind. Firstly, how do you personally reconcile with your idea of unintended consequences and the fact that a lot of sources say that Alexander, when he did go out to the far ends of the Persian Empire, he was encouraging even his soldiers to marry on with locals, and he himself took a wife. If he hadn't planned on actually try to stay longer or try to assimilate that area into the Greek culture?
Oh, I think the answer to that is that so much of what Alexander did had political ramifications, and he did it for political reasons. So I think, yes, there's probably not any more to it than that.
So it wasn't as unintended. Perhaps some of it, there was a grand plan that he might have had.
Well, look, there was this English scholar, W. Tarn, who wrote sort of at the height of the British Empire. And he came up with this idea that what Alexander was promoting was the brotherhood of mankind, the British Empire encircling, so much and incorporating so much. And Tarn put this forward. It's sort of an English gentleman's idea. This has been shot down, and people have totally rejected it, and so on. This is just, something that Tarn may ultimately made up, and there, no real evidence for it. So there's that aspect, that you can put forward all kinds of theories. That would have been something very greatly intended, but people don't. The serious scholars don't take that very serious today.
So the fact that he had a dark soul, we had read from sources that he treated the family of Darius quite respectfully, I understand?
Yeah, sure. You got good pawns, good pawns, you're not going to treat them badly, etc. So you treat them as well as possible, and so they're all the more valuable, Maybe Darius will come up with not just 30,000, pieces of silver, but maybe 30,000, 90,000, in inexhaustible supplies he had. So, yeah, no, I think
And
quite
lastly,
understandable.
thank you. And lastly, for the $68 million question, where do you think Alexander is buried?
Well, his sarcophagus is in Istanbul. It was found, I think, at Byblos, and Ptolemy I is supposed to have seen to it that his body went back to Egypt. So nobody knows. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. Yes.
I wanted to ask about Alexander's heirs, because I understand he did a kind of poor job of preparing for succession. Was like rather accidentally, just died sooner than expected, or
Alexander made no provisions for his succession at all. He married a girl from Afghanistan, i.e., up in Bactria. At the time of his death, she was pregnant. Of course, unknown at the time whether the child would be a boy or a girl. But whether he had any intentions in this respect with regard to his succession, nothing is said. We don't know at all. And from everything else. Look, even before he left Greece or Macedonia, his senior generals like Parmenion and Antipater said, look, you should do something about the succession. You could easily be killed. And it happened at the first battle, namely at the Granicus, within a hair's breadth, etc., and no provision for it. But we never hear in any of the sources that he ever made any provision for his succession. And even on his deathbed, we have details which suggest that it was a very ad hoc thing that he did.
didn't it just turn into his generals fighting over who got to keep the empire?
Well, yeah, they immediately they started fighting. Yes, yes. Anything else? Well, thank you very much. And again, oh, sorry. Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, where did the supply of his soldiers come from as he traveled through this enormous area and then kept at least some kind of military presence region by region? What was the source of the manpower that sustained this empire that he was establishing as he conquered?
You'll be surprised when I tell you. They came from Macedonia, virtually. He was sending back again and again for more troops. And this had an effect on the situation in Greece because Antipater was beginning to run out of military. And there was actually an attempt by the Spartans, a king of Sparta, to foment a revolution, an opposition to Alexander. And Antipater had to scramble, and it was a very difficult time for him. But again and again and again, Alexander was sending back messengers, namely for more troops. And to some extent, he fell back on Greeks. But wherever possible, it was amazing what Macedonia was actually able to produce and furnish for him. And these Macedonians were amazing.
I was wondering about Olympias, the mother of Alexander. You said she was very cruel and vindictive and revengeful. We'd see a bit more of her later. Is it known when she died, what she was up to back in Greece?
Yes, we do know, and I'm sorry, here my memory does fail me. Yes, she got involved in all kinds of things, and she was eliminated, if I remember correctly, by Cassander, who became king of Macedonia. He was the son of Antipater, and he became king of Macedonia in about 317, 316. And he was also responsible for getting rid of Alexander's son by his wife from Afghanistan, i.e. Bactria. Roxane was her name, and Cassander got rid of her, as well as the child. Yes, he killed both of them. And I would have to check it, but I think he may have had something to do also with getting rid of Olympias. Anyway, she died violently by someone.
2 hours with Ed Blado passes very easily, isn't it? Better than anything you get on television. I won't attempt to do any academic recall of what he's done. I simply couldn't. But those of you who are brewing questions you didn't want to risk in public, come and talk to him afterwards. But let's finish by giving him a hearty round of applause.